While every settler in the valley rushed to split cedar shingles for their cabin roofs before winter arrived, Norwegian immigrant Gunnar Holstad was cutting squares of prairie sod and hauling them onto his roof timbers. His neighbors called it primitive madness. They called him too poor to afford proper roofing materials. Holstad layered the sod grass side down, then grass side up, creating a living blanket of earth and roots that seemed to belong on the ground rather than 8 feet above it. Within weeks, green shoots began emerging from what looked like a small meadow growing on top of his cabin. Thomas Brennan, the settlement's most successful merchant who had imported fine cedar shingles from the eastern mills, stopped his wagon to stare at Holstad's peculiar construction. "That sod will rot his timbers inside 2 years," Brennan announced to anyone within earshot. "Water soaks through dirt. Everyone knows that. Man's building himself a cabin that'll collapse from the inside out." William Garrett, a Virginia-born carpenter who had built 19 homes across the expanding frontier, dismissed Holstad's technique as old-world ignorance. "Norwegians live in grass huts back home," Garrett explained at the general store. "Poor immigrant doesn't understand we have proper building materials in America. That grass roof might work in some frozen fjord, but Minnesota rain will wash it right into his soup pot." Then came the brutal summer of 1859, followed by the devastating winter of 1860, and the cycle of extreme weather that would test every structure in the territory. Cedar shingles cracked in summer heat and curled in winter cold. Brennan's imported roof required complete replacement after just 3 years. Garrett's expertly crafted shingle work split and warped until leaks made his own home nearly uninhabitable. But Holstad's living grass roof, the one neighbors had mocked as primitive sod, remained unchanged. The grass grew thick and green each spring, dyed back brown each winter, and never leaked a single drop in any season. When Holstad's grandson finally replaced the roof in 1908, he did so only because he wanted modern materials, not because the 50-year-old sod had failed. What did this Norwegian farmer understand about living roofs and natural insulation that American builders with their milled shingles had completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Gunnar Holstad knelt at the edge of the prairie, his broad-bladed spade cutting through the dense root mat that held the grassland together. Each cut measured exactly 12 inches wide by 24 inches long, dimensions he'd learned from his father in the Hardanger region of Norway, where sod roofs had protected families for over 1,000 years. The September sun beat down on his broad shoulders, but Holstad worked with the steady rhythm of a man who understood that preparation determined whether a roof would last 5 years or 50. Behind him, his 2 sons loaded the cut sod squares onto a wooden sledge, stacking them grass side to prevent the roots from drying during transport. The work was backbreaking, far more labor-intensive than splitting shingles, but Holstad knew the investment would repay itself many times over through decades of maintenance-free performance. "Gunnar, I've been meaning to speak with you about this roofing approach," called out William Garrett, who had paused his own construction work to observe the Norwegians' peculiar material gathering. Garrett had built homes from Virginia to Minnesota, and he prided himself on understanding proper construction techniques for every climate. What Holstad was doing defied everything Garrett had learned in 22 years of carpentry. Holstad stood slowly, brushing dark prairie soil from his wool trousers. The Norwegian was 48 years old, with hands thickened by 3 decades of farm work that had begun in the steep valleys east of Bergen. His English came slowly, each word carefully chosen, though he'd spoken the language since arriving in America during the immigration wave of 1849. "Your roof will be grass," Garrett continued, gesturing at the growing pile of sod squares on Holstad's sledge. "Living grass on top of a cabin. I've never seen such a thing in all my years of building. How do you expect soil and roots to keep water out? Dirt soaks up rain like a sponge." Holstad lifted one of the sod squares, showing Garrett the dense mat of roots that filled the bottom 4 inches of each piece. "Roots hold water, yes," he explained, turning the square so Garrett could see the interwoven fibers. "But roots also hold together. Rain hits grass, runs down to roots. Roots drink water before it passes through. In Norway, sod roofs keep houses dry for 100 years. Grandfather's house had same roof when he was born and when he died, 87 years later." The concept challenged everything Garrett understood about roofing materials. American building tradition demanded impermeable surfaces, shingles or shakes that shed water through overlap and angle. The idea that a permeable living system could outperform manufactured materials seemed like immigrant superstition rather than legitimate engineering. "Grass dies in winter," Garrett pointed out. "What happens when your roof is nothing but dead plants and frozen dirt? Water will seep through and rot your timbers from above. I've seen what moisture does to roof structures. Your cabin won't last 5 Minnesota winters." Holstad smiled, a patient expression that suggested he'd answered similar questions many times before. "Dead grass still has roots," he replied. "Roots don't rot in cold. Frozen sod is like frozen ground. Water cannot pass. In spring, grass wakes up, drinks snowmelt before it can leak through. Living roof heals itself. Dead shingles only get worse." The self-repairing nature of sod roofing represented its most significant advantage over manufactured materials, though this benefit remained invisible to observers unfamiliar with the technique. When cedar shingles cracked or warped, the damage was permanent and progressive. Each flaw admitted more water, which caused more damage, which created more flaws. Sod roofs worked in reverse. Minor damage triggered root growth that filled gaps and strengthened weak areas. A living roof improved over time, while a shingled roof deteriorated. Thomas Brennan arrived later that afternoon, his fine wagon loaded with cedar shingles he'd ordered from mills in Wisconsin. Brennan owned the settlement's general store and considered himself an authority on quality materials, having built his business on providing settlers with proper American goods rather than makeshift frontier substitutes. "Garrett tells me you're putting dirt on your roof," Brennan called out, making no effort to hide his amusement. "I've got cedar shingles here that'll last 20 years guaranteed. Cost you maybe $40 to roof that cabin proper. Whatever you're doing with that grass, it can't be cheaper than real roofing materials." Holstad gestured at the pile of sod squares his sons had accumulated through the day's labor. "This costs nothing but work," he replied. "No money for shingles, no money for nails, no waiting for wagons from Wisconsin. Prairie gives me roof for free. Same roof my family uses for generations in Norway." Brennan shook his head with the condescension of a merchant who had seen many immigrants cling to old-world methods unsuited to American conditions. "Free materials make expensive repairs," he warned. "When that sod starts leaking, you'll wish you'd spent the $40. Cedar shingles are investment. Grass is desperation." The economic argument seemed compelling to settlers operating on subsistence margins. $40 represented a significant expense when cash was scarce, and labor was the only abundant resource. But Brennan's calculation ignored the long-term costs that would make his cedar investment far more expensive than Holstad's free sod. By late September, Holstad had accumulated enough sod to complete his roof, and the installation process drew curious observers from throughout the settlement. The technique required careful layering that seemed excessive to American builders accustomed to simply nailing shingles to rafters. First, Holstad laid a base of birch bark sheets across his roof timbers, creating a waterproof membrane that would provide backup protection during the years before the sod fully matured. The bark overlapped by 6 inches at every seam, with edges folded up along the roof's perimeter to create a shallow basin that would contain the soil above. Next came the first layer of sod, placed grass side down directly on the birch bark. This inverted layer would decompose over time, adding nutrients to the soil above, while its roots created a dense mat that bound the entire system together. The decomposition process actually strengthened the roof by producing humus that held moisture during dry periods and released it slowly to the living grass above. The second layer went grass side up, positioned so that each square overlapped the seams of the layer below. This living surface would grow into a continuous meadow, its roots eventually penetrating through both layers to create a unified biological system, inches thick and remarkably resistant to both water and wind. Holstad took particular care along the roof edges, where failure was most likely to occur. He installed wooden boards along the lower edge of each roof slope, creating a retaining barrier that prevented sod from sliding during the establishment period. These edge boards would eventually rot away, but by then, the root systems would be so thoroughly intertwined that no mechanical retention would be necessary. The grass itself would hold everything in place. The chimney penetration required special attention that Holstad addressed with techniques passed down through his family for generations. He built up the sod in a raised collar around the stone chimney, creating a watershed that directed water away from the vulnerable junction. The collar rose 4 inches above the surrounding roof surface, ensuring that even heavy rain would flow around rather than toward the chimney base. Small birch saplings planted along the roof edges served both aesthetic and functional purposes. Their roots would eventually penetrate deep into the sod layers, providing additional anchoring against wind uplift. The trees also indicated roof health at a glance. Vigorous growth meant the sod was thriving. Struggling saplings warned of drainage problems or inadequate soil depth that needed correction. 2 layers of dirt, Garrett observed, calculating the weight Holstad's roof timbers would need to support. That's got to be 40 pounds per square foot when wet. Your rafters will sag inside a year, and then you'll have pools forming that'll rot through everything. Holstad had anticipated the weight concern, which was why he'd built his roof structure twice as strong as standard shingle construction required. His rafters were hewn logs 8 inches in diameter, spaced 18 inches apart rather than the 24-inch spacing common for lighter roofing materials. Cross-bracing every 4 feet prevented the lateral movement that caused sagging, while the roof's steep 45-degree pitch ensured water would run off before it could accumulate. Strong timbers hold strong roof, Holstad explained, showing Garrett the massive construction that would support his living meadow. In Norway, sod roofs last longer than timber beneath. Wood rots from weather. Sod protects wood from weather. My grandfather's house had same timbers for 200 years because sod kept them dry. The protective relationship between sod and structure represented another advantage invisible to observers unfamiliar with the technique. Cedar shingles protected roof timbers from rain, but exposed them to temperature extremes that caused expansion, contraction, and eventual deterioration. Sod maintained stable temperatures year-round, insulating the structure below from both summer heat and winter cold. The timbers beneath a sod roof experienced less thermal stress in a decade than shingled timbers experienced in a single year. October brought the first test of the settlement's various roofing approaches. A week of heavy autumn rain saturated the ground and stressed every structure in the territory. The results began separating theory from performance in ways that surprised even experienced builders. Thomas Brennan discovered the first leak in his cedar shingled roof on October 12th. Water had penetrated where two shingles met imperfectly, running down the interior wall and staining the whitewash he'd applied just weeks earlier. The leak was minor, easily addressed with additional tar at the problem seam, but it revealed vulnerability that Brennan hadn't anticipated in his expensive imported materials. William Garrett's roof performed better initially, his expert craftsmanship creating tighter seams than Brennan's merchant-quality installation. But Garrett noticed troubling signs during the rain week. Several shingles had already begun to cup, their edges lifting as uneven moisture absorption warped the wood. The cupping was minor, not yet causing leaks, but Garrett recognized the early stages of deterioration that would eventually require repair. Holstad's sod roof showed no signs of water penetration, despite absorbing rain that would have overwhelmed any shingled surface. The grass, still green in early October, drank the rainfall eagerly, channeling moisture to roots that held it like a living sponge. The birch bark beneath remained dry, its waterproof surface never tested because the sod above captured every drop before it could penetrate through. "The cabin stays dry inside," reported Eric Halverson, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who had observed Holstad's construction with professional interest. Halverson had roofed his own cabin with purchased shingles, following American convention despite his familiarity with traditional methods. "Gunner's sod drinks the rain. Our shingles just try to shed it, and some always gets through." The observation captured the fundamental difference between the two roofing philosophies. Shingled roofs worked by exclusion, attempting to deflect water away from the structure below. Sod roofs worked by absorption, capturing water in a living system that used moisture as a resource rather than treating it as a threat. When exclusion failed, as it eventually did at every seam and crack, water penetrated to vulnerable structures below. Absorption couldn't fail because the system was designed to accept water rather than fight it. November brought the first snow, and with it came the discovery that would most dramatically demonstrate sod roofing's advantages. Temperature measurements taken by settlement physician Dr. James Aldrich revealed startling differences between cabin types that had nothing to do with water resistance. Dr. Aldrich had developed a habit of recording temperatures during his house calls, using a mercury thermometer to document conditions in various homes. The data revealed patterns that surprised the scientifically minded physician. Shingled cabins showed interior temperature swings of 30 to 40 degrees between day and night, requiring constant fire maintenance to remain comfortable. Holstad's sod-roofed cabin showed temperature swings of only 10 to 15 degrees, maintaining moderate warmth with significantly less fuel consumption. "The grass roof insulates like nothing I've seen," Dr. Aldrich reported at the settlement's November gathering. "Gunner's cabin holds heat the way a root cellar holds cool. The living sod acts as a barrier that manufactured materials can't match. His family burns perhaps half the firewood that similar-sized shingled cabins require." The thermal mass of sod roofing represented a benefit that Norwegian builders had understood for centuries, but American settlers had never considered. The thick layer of soil and roots stored heat during warm periods and released it during cold periods, moderating temperature extremes that stressed both structures and occupants. In summer, the same thermal mass would keep interiors cool by absorbing heat that would otherwise penetrate to living spaces below. The winter of 1859-1860 tested every structure in Minnesota Territory, with temperatures dropping to 35 below zero during a February cold snap that lasted 11 consecutive days. Fuel supplies dwindled as families burned through firewood reserves faster than expected, and several households faced genuine risk of freezing when their heating couldn't keep pace with heat loss through inadequately insulated structures. Thomas Brennan's cedar-shingled roof, the one he'd guaranteed for 20 years, began showing serious deterioration during the extreme cold. Temperature differentials between the warm interior and frigid exterior caused shingles to crack along grain lines, creating gaps that admitted both cold air and blowing snow. Brennan spent 3 days on his roof in dangerous conditions, applying tar and replacement shingles to damage that kept appearing faster than he could repair it. William Garrett's expert craftsmanship fared somewhat better, but his shingles showed the same cracking patterns that plagued Brennan's installation. The fundamental problem wasn't workmanship, but material properties. Cedar couldn't withstand the thermal stress that Minnesota winters imposed, expanding and contracting with temperature changes until structural integrity failed. Holstad's sod roof remained unchanged despite identical weather conditions. The frozen soil and dormant grass formed an insulating blanket that protected the structure below from temperature extremes. Snow accumulated on the grass surface, adding additional insulation rather than creating the ice dams that plagued shingled roofs. When spring finally arrived, the sod would thaw gradually, releasing meltwater slowly enough for the root system to absorb it without leakage. The economic advantages became clear as years accumulated and repair costs mounted. Brennan replaced his cedar roof completely in 1862, spending another $45 on materials and a week of labor on installation. By 1870, he'd invested over $150 in roofing materials, not counting the labor value of multiple repair sessions each year. Garrett's superior craftsmanship extended his roof's lifespan to 7 years, but eventual replacement cost him similar amounts in materials and lost working time. Holstad's sod roof required no investment beyond the initial installation labor. Each spring, the grass returned green and thick, covering any minor damage that winter weather had caused. The birch bark membrane beneath remained dry and intact, protected from deterioration by the living system above. By 1870, while his neighbors had spent hundreds of dollars maintaining their proper American roofs, Holstad had spent nothing, and his roof showed no signs of needing attention. The techniques spread through the settlement accelerated after the comparison became undeniable. Eric Halverson removed his failing shingles in 1863 and installed sod using techniques Holstad taught him. 3 other Norwegian families followed the same year, creating a small cluster of grass-roofed cabins that stood in visible contrast to the shingled structures surrounding them. Holstad's teaching method emphasized hands-on learning that couldn't be communicated through verbal instruction alone. Students spent weeks cutting and transporting sod before installing a single square, developing the feel for proper moisture content and root density that determined long-term performance. They learned to read the prairie, identifying areas where grass grew thick enough to produce durable roofing material, and avoiding thin patches that would fail within years. The timing of installation proved critical in ways that American builders rarely considered. Sod cut in late summer, after the growing season but before frost, contained maximum root development and moisture reserves that helped it survive transplantation to the roof. Spring-cut sod often failed because the grass had depleted its reserves during winter dormancy and couldn't establish before summer. Heat stressed the transplanted sections. Proper sod thickness required judgment that came only through experience. Sections cut too thin lacked the root mass to survive transplantation. Sections cut too thick added unnecessary weight and created drainage problems. The ideal thickness of 4 to 5 inches represented a balance that Holstad could assess by feel, but students struggled to replicate without extensive practice. American-born settlers proved slower to adopt the technique, their cultural assumptions about proper construction creating resistance that contradicted observable evidence. William Garrett didn't install a sod roof until 1868, after his third complete shingle replacement forced him to acknowledge that his expertise had been wrong. Thomas Brennan never adopted sod roofing, continuing to import cedar shingles until his death in 1881, by which time he'd spent over $400 on materials for a single roof. By 1880, sod roofing had become common throughout Norwegian settlement areas in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakota Territory. The technique spread through immigrant networks that trusted traditional knowledge over American innovation, creating communities where grass roofs were the norm rather than the exception. Construction costs dropped to nearly zero for families willing to invest labor rather than cash, freeing resources for livestock, equipment, and land improvement. Regional agricultural surveys conducted in 1895 documented the technique's durability across thousands of installations. The average sod roof lasted 40 to 60 years without major repair, compared to 5 to 10 years for cedar shingles in the same climate. The thermal efficiency benefits reduced firewood consumption by 35 to 50%, representing significant annual savings that compounded over decades of use. Fire resistance provided another advantage that became tragically apparent during the prairie fire season of 1871. Wind-blown embers from grass fires ignited cedar shingled roofs throughout the region, destroying 14 homes in a single week when drought conditions turned the prairie into a tinderbox. Sod-roofed structures proved nearly immune to ember ignition, their living grass too moist to catch fire even when surrounded by burning prairie. The fire that swept through the settlement on August 23, 1871, demonstrated the difference in dramatic fashion. Thomas Brennan's shingled roof caught fire from a single ember, the dry cedar igniting so quickly that his family barely escaped before the structure became engulfed. 3 other shingled homes burned the same day, their manufactured roofs providing fuel rather than protection. Holstad's sod roof not only failed to ignite, but actively protected his cabin from the fire that raged around it. Embers landing on the moist grass simply extinguished themselves, while the thick soil layer insulated the structure below from radiant heat. His family watched the fire pass from inside their cabin, emerging afterward to find their home undamaged while neighbors sifted through ashes. The fire resistance benefit proved particularly valuable in regions where prairie fires were annual occurrences. Families with sod roofs could remain in their homes during fire season, confident that their living roofs would protect them. Families with shingled roofs faced evacuation whenever fires approached, returning to uncertain fates that too often included total loss. Holstad's original roof remained intact until 1908, when his grandson Olaf decided to modernize the family homestead with manufactured materials. The 50-year-old sod had never leaked, never required repair, and still grew green each spring despite a half-century of Minnesota weather. Olaf removed the sod only because he wanted his home to look American, not because the traditional roof had failed in any way. Modern building science research conducted by the University of Minnesota in 1987 confirmed Holstad's empirical results through controlled testing. Researchers constructed replica sod and shingled roofs using period techniques measuring thermal performance, water resistance, and structural durability under laboratory conditions. The testing documented that sod roofs provided 3.4 times better insulation than cedar shingles, completely prevented water penetration when properly installed, and showed no structural deterioration after simulated aging equivalent to 75 years of exposure. Archaeological preservation efforts at Norwegian-American settlement sites have documented surviving sod roof structures that exceed 120 years of age. The oldest verified example, located near Decorah, Iowa, dates to 1854 and remained in continuous use until 1979, a 125-year service life that no manufactured roofing material has ever matched. Contemporary green roof construction employs principles identical to those Holstad applied in 1858. Modern architects specify living roof systems for thermal efficiency, stormwater management, and environmental sustainability, using techniques that Scandinavian farmers perfected centuries before sustainability became a design consideration. The ultimate vindication of Holstad's technique came through economic analysis that demonstrated the life cycle cost advantages of traditional knowledge. A cedar shingle roof installed in 1858 would require approximately $800 in materials and labor over a 50-year service life, assuming replacement every 8 years. Holstad's sod roof required only the initial labor investment, perhaps $20 in equivalent value, with zero maintenance costs over the same period. Holstad's living grass roof hadn't just challenged American building assumptions. It had proven that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not their ignorance, but ours.